paralysis that gripped the garden dissipated almost as quickly as it had arrived, replaced by that particular chaos that occurs when civilized people suddenly find themselves confronted with the undeniable reality of death. Mrs. Merriweather made a second sound, this one decidedly more articulate, a sharp intake of breath that bordered on hysteria. Her hand fluttered upward as if seeking something to hold on to, and it was Victoria who moved first, stepping toward her mother-in-law with the kind of automatic gesture that people made when social training overrode personal inclination. "Mother," Victoria said softly, the single word carrying both comfort and distance. "Perhaps you should sit down. Inside, perhaps. This is quite a shock." Dr. Fielding straightened from his examination, his professional demeanor already settling into place like a familiar coat retrieved from a wardrobe. He moved toward Mrs. Merriweather with the measured pace of a man accustomed to managing crisis, placing a gentle but firm hand on her elbow. "Constance, I think Victoria is quite right. You should go inside. This is a matter for the authorities now." Edmund Fielding's voice carried that particular quality of command disguised as suggestion that made people comply without quite realizing they were being directed. He nodded toward his wife. "Margaret, would you be so kind as to accompany Mrs. Merriweather to the house? I believe she might benefit from some water and perhaps something stronger if the circumstances warrant it." Margaret Fielding, who had been standing in that peculiar state of arrested shock, seemed almost relieved to have a task assigned to her. She stepped forward with renewed purpose, taking Mrs. Merriweather's other arm, and together the two women began moving toward the house with the careful slowness of people navigating terrain made suddenly uncertain. The other guests stood in small clusters, their conversations having resumed at a volume barely above whisper. Miss Marple noted the texture of these resumed conversations. They were not expressions of genuine concern, but rather exercises in collective processing, the village mind attempting to make sense of an event that resisted neat categorization. The ladies' committee had reformed, and Miss Marple could hear fragments of their discussion drifting across the lawn. So sudden, no warning. At his age, one would think. Though Charles Merriweather had been only 35, and there was nothing in his appearance, whatever its other deficiencies, to suggest imminent mortality. Dr. Ashford had moved to stand near his sister's abandoned chair, his posture suggesting both concern and something more complicated. His eyes, Miss Marple noted, kept returning to the body on the table with a kind of analytical attention that suggested his mind was already engaged in the process of understanding what had occurred. He was, after all, a physician, and even retired physicians could not entirely divest themselves of their professional habits. "I shall need to notify the police," Dr. Fielding was saying to no one in particular, though his words seemed directed toward Dr. Ashford. "This will need to be handled properly. An examination, an inquest, all the necessary procedures." "Of course," Dr. Ashford replied, his voice calm and measured. "Though I confess I'm curious about the immediate circumstances. Charles was quite alive when I entered the garden not 40 minutes ago. He seemed as he always does. Somewhat preoccupied, perhaps. Or is that not accurate?" Dr. Fielding's expression shifted slightly, though whether it indicated agreement or demurral was difficult to discern. "Charles has been under considerable strain in recent months. Business matters, I believe, though he was not forthcoming about particulars." This statement hung in the air with the weight of incomplete information. Miss Marple, positioning herself near the roses as if still admiring their horticultural qualities, observed the precise moment when Victoria's shoulders tightened almost imperceptibly, and the way Dr. Ashford's eyes narrowed with what might have been recognition of hidden meanings beneath the spoken words. The ambulance arrived within 30 minutes, summoned by Dr. Fielding with that particular efficiency that came from knowing precisely which telephone number to call and what information to convey in what order. The two attendants, young men from the neighboring town of Ashford, moved with practiced professionalism that somehow managed to be both respectful and impersonal. They transferred Charles Merryweather's body to a stretcher with movements that had become routine through repetition, though Miss Marple noted that even routine actions seemed to take on a ceremonial quality when applied to the dead. The police arrived shortly after in the form of Inspector Raymond Blackwood, a man of approximately 50 who possessed the particular quality of authority that came from having made enough correct decisions in his career to feel confident about the ones he would make in the future. He was accompanied by a younger sergeant, fresh-faced and eager in the manner of those still early in their professional trajectories. Inspector Blackwood surveyed the garden with an expression that suggested he had seen this particular configuration before: the assembled guests, the scene of death, the delicate balance between public spectacle and private tragedy. "I shall need statements from everyone present," Inspector Blackwood announced, his voice carrying across the garden with the natural authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "I understand this was a garden party. Perhaps someone could explain precisely how Mr. Merryweather came to be on that table." It was a question that revealed the inherent difficulty of the situation. No one had actually observed Charles Merryweather's collapse. He had been present, engaged in his own pursuits, mostly involving the acquisition of increasingly strong beverages, and then he had simply appeared on the table in that final, permanent state. Miss Marple, observing from her position near the roses, noted something that the others seemed to have overlooked in the immediate shock of discovery. The teacup beside Charles's hand did not contain tea. The liquid remaining in its depths was barely visible, but what could be seen suggested something considerably less benign than the elderflower, cordial being served to other guests. The cup, moreover, had a faint residue along its inner rim, a kind of crystalline deposit that caught the light at particular angles. She had seen such deposits before, in a case that had involved the careful poisoning of a particularly unpleasant magistrate in a village not unlike Little Brackley. The substance had been arsenic then, administered in precisely calculated doses through exactly this kind of innocuous vessel. Inspector Blackwood was already moving toward the table, his professional instincts leading him toward the same observation Miss Marple had made, but he would proceed through official channels, through laboratory analysis and formal investigation, through the machinery of law that moved with deliberate precision. Miss Marple, meanwhile, had already begun to note something far more important than the chemical composition of the liquid in the cup. She had begun to observe the faces around her, to catalogue the reactions, the moments when masks slipped, the precise instant when the assembled guests had understood that they were no longer mourning an unexpected death from natural causes, but rather witnesses to something considerably more sinister. And in those observations, she believed, lay the seeds of truth. Inspector Blackwood moved with the deliberate care of a man who had learned that crime scenes, like medical patients, could be harmed by careless handling. He approached the table where Charles Merryweather's body had been, now removed by the ambulance attendants, but leaving behind a kind of psychological indentation in the white linen. The teacup remained exactly as it had been found, and Blackwood bent to examine it with the focused attention of someone reading a document written in a language he was slowly learning to decode. "Sergeant Hartley," Blackwood called without looking away from the cup. "Photograph this, would you, and ensure nothing is disturbed until we've had it properly analyzed." The sergeant, who had been making preliminary notes on a small pad, immediately produced a camera from the black bag he carried. The sound of the shutter clicking seemed to create a kind of punctuation mark in the afternoon, a moment where the garden party definitively transformed into a police investigation. Miss Marple, still standing near the roses with what appeared to be genuine horticultural interest, watched as Dr. Fielding moved toward Inspector Blackwood with the purposeful stride of someone who had a professional obligation to assist with matters of death. "Inspector, I should inform you that I've already examined the deceased, and in my professional opinion, death occurred no more than an hour ago. Possibly considerably less." Edmund Fielding's voice carried that particular tone of doctors addressing police, respectful but also subtly insistent on the validity of medical expertise. Given the circumstances of collapse at a social gathering and the appearance of the beverage in that cup, I would suggest you consider the possibility of poisoning." Blackwood straightened, his grey eyes sharpening with the kind of focus that separated competent inspectors from merely adequate ones. "Poisoning, Dr. Fielding. That's quite an assertion. What leads you to that conclusion?" "The teacup residue, primarily," Edmund replied, gesturing toward the cup without touching it. "The crystalline deposit along the interior suggests the presence of a substance that would not naturally occur in any of the refreshments being served today. Additionally, Mr. Merriweather's collapse was sudden and complete. There was no gradual deterioration, no apparent struggle for breath. The kind of immediate unconsciousness followed by what appears to be cardiac arrest suggests a substance designed to act with particular swiftness." Inspector Blackwood nodded slowly, the kind of nod that suggested he was filing away information even as he processed it. "And you're quite certain of this assessment?" "I'm certain enough to recommend that assumption," Dr. Fielding said carefully. "The formal analysis will, of course, provide definitive answers." The conversation had drawn attention. Mrs. Dorothy Ashford, one of the ladies' committee, had detached herself from the protective huddle that her group had formed and was now moving toward the inspector with the kind of determined stride that suggested she had information of importance to convey. She was a woman of 60, thin to the point of angularity, with sharp features that seemed designed for expressions of disapproval and concern in equal measure. "Inspector Blackwood, I believe I may have relevant information," Mrs. Ashford announced, her voice carrying that particular quality of someone accustomed to being listened to. "You see, I observed Charles at approximately 3 o'clock, perhaps slightly before. He was standing near the refreshment table. Indeed, he appeared to be examining the beverages quite closely. I remember thinking at the time that he seemed considerably more interested in the alcohol than was perhaps appropriate for an afternoon gathering." "And did you observe anyone approaching him?" Blackwood inquired, his notepad already in hand. "Anyone offering him a drink, perhaps? Anyone with whom he spoke?" Mrs. Ashford paused, her expression shifting into the particular concentration of someone attempting to reconstruct the past. From the interior of Merriweather Manor seemed to have absorbed the shock of the afternoon with the kind of muted resignation that old houses possessed when confronted with human tragedy. The hallway, normally a space of quiet elegance with its Persian rugs and oil paintings of distant Merriweather ancestors, now felt somehow diminished, as if the walls themselves had contracted in response to the weight of what had occurred beyond them. Inspector Blackwood moved through this space with Sergeant Hartley at his side, his eyes cataloguing details with the mechanical precision of someone trained to see significance in the ordinary. Mrs. Merriweather had been settled in the drawing-room, a space that seemed deliberately designed to impose a sense of order and control through its arrangement of furniture and carefully curated artworks. She sat on a burgundy velvet settee, her cream silk dress now appearing distinctly incongruous against the afternoon's revelation. Beside her, Margaret Fielding maintained a posture of supportive proximity that was just close enough to suggest concern without infringing upon Mrs. Merriweather's personal territory. A cup of tea sat untouched on the table beside the settee, a detail that did not escape Miss Marple's notice when she entered the room behind the inspector, having requested permission to observe the proceedings on the basis of her long experience with village matters and her friendship with the Merriweather family. Inspector Blackwood had, somewhat to Miss Marple's surprise, acquiesced to her presence. Perhaps he recognized in her the particular quality of trustworthiness that age and seeming inconsequence provided. Or perhaps he simply understood that a village investigation functioned most smoothly when the village's most respected observer remained informed rather than relegated to speculation among her peers. "Mrs. Merriweather," Blackwood began, his voice carrying that particular gentleness reserved for questioning those who had experienced immediate loss. "I understand this is an extraordinarily difficult time. However, I must ask you several questions regarding your son's death. Your cooperation will be invaluable in determining precisely what occurred this afternoon." Mrs. Merriweather's face, which had possessed such controlled elegance during the garden party's earlier moments, now appeared to have partially disintegrated. Her makeup, applied with such precision that morning, had begun to blur the edges, particularly around her eyes, where tears had traced careful paths down her powdered cheeks. When she spoke, her voice emerged thin and somewhat distant, as if traveling from a considerable distance to reach the present moment. "I cannot imagine, Inspector, how my son's death could be anything other than a terrible accident. Charles has always been. He was always delicate constitutionally. The doctors have warned him repeatedly about the consumption of alcohol on an empty stomach. It is entirely possible that he simply overindulged, and his heart simply—" She trailed away, her hands fluttering upward as if searching for the correct words to complete the sentence. "Madam, I must inform you that Dr. Fielding has suggested the possibility of poisoning," Blackwood said carefully, watching her reaction with the intensity of someone reading a text written in human behavior. "The teacup from which your son was drinking contained residue suggesting the presence of a substance other than the refreshments being served. Would you have any knowledge of how such a substance might have entered your son's beverage?" The color drained from Mrs. Merriweather's face with such completeness that Miss Marple momentarily wondered whether the woman might require medical attention herself. Margaret Fielding's hand moved protectively toward Mrs. Merriweather's shoulder, though she did not quite make contact. "Poisoning," Mrs. Merriweather repeated, the words seeming to fragment on her lips. "That is impossible. Absolutely impossible. This is Little Brackley, Inspector. This is not the sort of place where such things occur. There must be some mistake. Some terrible, terrible mistake." Yet even as she spoke these words, Miss Marple observed something interesting occurring in Mrs. Merriweather's expression. Beneath the shock and the denial, something else flickered, something that looked remarkably like recognition. Not of the act of poisoning itself, perhaps, but of the possibility that poisoning might have occurred. The kind of recognition that suggested Mrs. Merriweather was not entirely unprepared for tragedy, even if she had not anticipated precisely this form of it. "When did you last observe your son this afternoon?" Blackwood continued, making notes on his pad with methodical precision. "Perhaps 2 o'clock? I was engaged with guests throughout the afternoon, Inspector. I cannot account for every moment of Charles' activities. He was a grown man, after all. I did not feel it appropriate to monitor his movements during a social gathering." The defensive quality in her voice suggested she understood how this response might appear. A mother negligent of her son's whereabouts, however adult he might be. Inspector Blackwood did not immediately respond to this statement. Instead, he allowed a moment of silence to expand between them, a technique that Miss Marple recognized as one of the more effective instruments in an investigator's arsenal. In the absence of immediate questions, people frequently felt compelled to fill the void with additional information, often of their own volition. "I should mention," Mrs. Merriweather continued, her voice dropping slightly, "that Charles had been under considerable financial strain recently. There were business matters that proved troublesome. He had become increasingly irritable, increasingly inclined toward solitary drinking. I had spoken to him about seeking professional assistance, but he was resistant to the suggestion. Victoria and I had discussed the matter, though not extensively. Such things are delicate to discuss between a mother and son. This revelation hung in the air with the weight of significant information." Miss Marple noted the precise moment when Margaret Fielding's grip on her teacup tightened and the manner in which her eyes shifted away from Mrs. Merriweather's face, as if she suddenly found the painting on the opposite wall of extraordinary interest. "Financial difficulties of what nature?" Blackwood inquired, his pen poised above his notepad. "I am not entirely certain of the particulars," Mrs. Merriweather replied carefully. "Charles managed his own affairs. However, I gathered that there had been some losses in his investments. business ventures that had not produced the anticipated returns. Outside, the evening was settling across Little Brackley with the inevitability of darkness following light. Inside the drawing room, Miss Marple sat quietly in her chair near the window, her small frame barely disturbing the cushion beneath her, her pale blue eyes absorbing information with the methodical precision of someone for whom observation had become not merely a habit, but a fundamental approach to understanding the world. Inspector Blackwood's questioning of Mrs. Merriweather continued for another 20 minutes, though the additional questions yielded information of diminishing significance. Mrs. Merriweather, having revealed what she deemed necessary, had settled into a state of controlled grief that allowed her to respond to inquiries with appropriate solemnity, while offering little additional detail of investigative value. When Blackwood finally excused himself, suggesting that Mrs. Merriweather rest and that he would require her further statements once she had recovered somewhat from the immediate shock, it was with the air of a man who recognized when additional pressure would yield only defensive reactions rather than genuine information. In the hallway, Sergeant Hartley was waiting with a small notebook and an expression of cautious excitement that suggested he had gathered information of some consequence during the interviews with the household staff and temporary workers. "The gardener, Mr. Patrice, has provided us with a timeline of staff movements, sir," Hartley reported, his enthusiasm barely contained beneath his professional demeanor. "It appears that access to the refreshment table was considerably less restricted than one might have assumed. The temporary staff members were circulating throughout the afternoon, refilling supplies, clearing used plates and cups. Mr. Patrice mentioned that approximately 20 minutes before Mr. Merriweather's collapse, he observed a staff member, one of the temporary workers, a young man named Thomas Wickham, removing several items from the refreshment table and carrying them toward the kitchen. Did this Wickham person appear to be engaged in routine work, or did his behavior seem unusual?" Blackwood inquired, his investigative instincts already engaged. "That is where matters become somewhat complex, sir," Hartley continued, consulting his notes with the precision of someone determined not to misreport even minor details. Mr. Patrice stated that Wickham's behavior was entirely routine, consistent with the work he had been engaged to perform. However, one of the other temporary staff members, a woman named Mrs. Eleanor Bowles, mentioned something of potential interest. She observed Wickham speaking briefly with Mr. Charles Merriweather near the refreshment table. She could not specify precisely what was discussed, but she mentioned that the conversation seemed, her words, rather intimate, as if between people with something to discuss beyond ordinary pleasantries. Miss Marple, who had followed the two police officers into the hallway with the kind of unobtrusive movement that seemed to occur naturally in her presence, felt that particular internal shift that accompanied the emergence of significant information. Connections began to form in her mind, not yet solidifying into certainty, but rather circulating in the preliminary stages of coherence that preceded genuine understanding. "Where is this Thomas Wickham now?" Blackwood asked, his tones sharpening with the intensity of focused investigation. "That presents a difficulty, sir," Hartley admitted, his earlier enthusiasm dimming somewhat. "According to Mr. Patrice, Wickham departed from the premises approximately 40 minutes ago. He informed his supervisor that his services were no longer required due to the disruption caused by Mr. Merriweather's collapse. He collected his payment and left. Mr. Patrice provided his address, a rooming house in the village proper, but Hartley has not yet been dispatched to investigate his whereabouts." Inspector Blackwood's expression shifted into the particular configuration of a man confronted with a complication that suggested either guilt or extreme misfortune. "Sergeant, I want you to proceed to this rooming house immediately. Speak with Wickham if he is present. Determine his whereabouts for the precise period during which we believe the poisoning occurred, and attempt to ascertain what connection, if any, exists between him and Charles Merriweather." As Hartley departed with renewed purpose, Blackwood turned to find Miss Marple standing quietly beside a small table that displayed a collection of Meissen porcelain. He regarded her with the expression of someone who had momentarily forgotten that others were present, but was now processing that reality. "Miss Marple," he said, with the courtesy that extended to those clearly beyond any suspicion of guilt, "I wonder if you might offer your perspective on this matter. You have resided in Little Brackley for some time, I understand. What can you tell me regarding Charles Merryweather and the social circumstances that might have motivated such a dramatic act as poisoning?" Miss Marple turned from her examination of the porcelain, her small frame settling into an attitude of thoughtful consideration. "I confess, Inspector, that I have only recently become aware of financial difficulties affecting Mr. Merryweather. However, in my experience, poisoning is rarely motivated by financial matters alone. Money is often the stated reason for violence, but the actual motivations frequently involve elements of personal betrayal, romantic entanglement, or the protection of secrets that individuals believe more valuable than the lives of those who might expose them." "You suggest, then, that Charles Merryweather possessed knowledge that someone wished desperately to suppress?" Blackwood inquired, his notepad already in hand. "I suggest nothing definitively," Miss Marple replied with her characteristic caution. "I merely observe that in villages, and Little Brackley is very much a village in the deepest sense, people maintain surfaces of considerable respectability while harboring depths of significant complication. When those depths are threatened with exposure, the reactions can be quite severe." Dr. Ashford emerged from the library at that precise moment, his expression suggesting he had been engaged in some form of private reflection. He regarded the inspector and Miss Marple with the measured assessment of someone attempting to determine what conversation he had interrupted. "Inspector Blackwood, I believe I may possess information relevant to your investigation," Dr. Ashford announced, his voice carrying the particular quality of someone accustomed to being listened to with attention. "I've been reflecting upon the afternoon's events, and I have recalled something that may prove significant. Approximately 2 weeks ago, I encountered Charles Merryweather in the village. He appeared considerably agitated, and when I inquired regarding his well-being, he made a statement that struck me as curious. He said, and I quote as precisely as memory allows, "Some people will do anything to protect what they believe is rightfully theirs." At the time, I assumed he was merely expressing frustration regarding his financial difficulties. However, in light of this afternoon's events, that statement acquires a rather different meaning. Inspector Blackwood's expression shifted into that particular configuration of focused intensity that accompanied the emergence of information that seemed to bridge separate investigative threads. He turned toward Dr. Ashford with renewed attention, his notepad already positioned for the documentation of this new revelation. "Dr. Ashford, this statement is of considerable significance," Blackwood said carefully. "Would you elaborate further upon the circumstances of this conversation? Where precisely did this encounter occur, and what was the tenor of Mr. Merryweather's demeanor beyond the words themselves?" Dr. Ashford settled into one of the hallway's chairs with the measured movements of someone who had learned long ago that standing for extended periods was a luxury youth possessed, but age did not. "The encounter occurred outside the post office approximately 2 weeks ago. Charles appeared. Agitated is perhaps too strong a descriptor. Rather, he seemed preoccupied, almost haunted by some internal concern. When I inquired, he initially demurred from providing explanation. However, upon my pressing the matter, he offered the statement I mentioned. His tone suggested not mere frustration regarding financial matters, but rather something considerably more personal. There was an element of, I suppose one might characterize it as vindictive satisfaction mixed with apprehension. Miss Marple, who had maintained her position near the Meissen collection with the unobtrusive quality of furniture, felt the various pieces of information she had gathered throughout the afternoon begin to shift into new configurations. The financial difficulties that Mrs. Merryweather had mentioned, the strange intimacy between Charles and the temporary staff member, the appearance of Dr. Ashford's unexpected return to the village, All of these elements now seemed to orbit around some central fact that remained as yet unexposed. "I find myself wondering," Miss Marple ventured softly, addressing neither inspector nor doctor specifically, but rather allowing her observation to settle into the space between them, whether the financial difficulties Mr. Merriweather experienced were entirely the result of unfortunate investment decisions. "In my considerable experience with human nature, money problems frequently become intertwined with matters of personal conduct. What appears on the surface as simple mismanagement often conceals far more complicated realities." Blackwood regarded Miss Marple with an expression that suggested he was reassessing his initial evaluation of her significance. "Miss Marple, you raise an intriguing possibility. Are you suggesting that Charles Merriweather's financial difficulties may have been connected to some form of personal misconduct?" "I am suggesting nothing more definitive than what the facts themselves suggest," Miss Marple replied with her characteristic precision. "However, I've observed that when a young man of apparent respectability suddenly experiences financial strain, and when that same young man appears agitated regarding the protection of something he believes rightfully his, the situation frequently involves either theft, embezzlement, or the concealment of some secret that other parties possess knowledge of and might be disposed to reveal." At that precise moment, Dr. Edmund Fielding descended the staircase with the purposeful stride of someone who had completed the task he had undertaken. He had, as he explained to Inspector Blackwood, examined Mrs. Merriweather and determined that while she was understandably distressed, she required no immediate medical intervention beyond rest and time. However, he had also spoken with Victoria Merriweather, who had provided him with information that Edmund deemed significant enough to communicate directly to the investigative authorities. "Victoria has informed me that Charles's financial difficulties were more severe than his mother appeared to acknowledge," Edmund reported, settling into a chair near Dr. Ashford with the manner of a man who understood that this information required proper documentation. "Apparently, Charles had made several business investments approximately 18 months ago, investments that she characterized as experimental and conducted without the knowledge or approval of his mother. These investments had not merely failed, they had resulted in significant losses that Charles had attempted to conceal through various accounting manipulations. Victoria became aware of the situation only recently, when creditors began making inquiries." "And how did Victoria respond to this revelation?" Blackwood inquired, his investigative instincts clearly engaged by this complication. "With appropriate concern, one would assume," Edmund replied, "though I must confess that Victoria's emotional responses are somewhat difficult to interpret. She maintains a considerable emotional distance from most situations. She informed me that she had confronted Charles regarding the financial deceptions and that they had engaged in what she characterized as a difficult conversation approximately 1 week ago." Miss Marple found her mind circling around a particular detail that had emerged earlier in Dr. Ashford's account. The statement Charles had made, "Some people will do anything to protect what they believe is rightfully theirs," suggested not merely financial concern, but rather a threat to something of deeper personal significance. Combined with Victoria's recent discovery of financial improprieties and the mysterious conversation between Charles and the temporary staff member named Thomas Wickham, a pattern began to emerge that possessed a certain internal coherence. "I'm curious," Miss Marple ventured, her eyes moving between the assembled men with that particular quality of innocent inquiry that masked considerably more sophisticated analysis, "whether anyone has yet determined precisely what substance was used to poison Mr. Merriweather. Dr. Fielding, in your professional assessment, what toxins produce the kind of immediate unconsciousness followed by cardiac arrest that characterized Mr. Merriweather's demise?" Edmund Fielding's expression shifted slightly, as if he were considering whether to provide information that might be considered beyond the appropriate scope of his knowledge. However, he appeared to recognize in Miss Marple the particular quality of discretion that came with age and reputation. "Several substances produce such effects," Edmund replied carefully. Digitalis, in sufficient concentrations, produces precisely that symptomatology, as does cyanide, though typically with somewhat more dramatic presentation. However, the most likely candidate, given the apparent lack of external distress, would be some form of cardiac glycoside. Digitalis would be the most accessible such substance to a person without particular pharmaceutical training. And digitalis, Miss Marple observed gently, would be a substance that a country physician, or retired country physician, might have access to in considerable quantities, would it not? The silence that followed Miss Marple's observation seemed to expand through the hallway with the weight of implications that none of the assembled men wished to acknowledge directly. Dr. Fielding's hand moved to his throat, an unconscious gesture suggesting the physical manifestation of sudden discomfort. Inspector Blackwood's eyes narrowed as he processed the implications of what Miss Marple had delicately suggested. Dr. Ashford, however, remained perfectly still, his expression revealing nothing beyond a kind of clinical interest in the direction the conversation had assumed. "Miss Marple," Inspector Blackwood said carefully, his voice carrying a new quality of formal precision, "I must confess that your inference regarding pharmaceutical accessibility is both astute and concerning. However, I should note that many individuals possess access to cardiac glycosides. Physicians, certainly, but also nurses, pharmacists, and indeed, anyone with a modicum of determination and knowledge of where such substances might be obtained." "Indeed," Miss Marple acknowledged with her characteristic acceptance of correction, "though I suspect that in a village of Little Brackley's modest size, the number of individuals possessing both the knowledge and the opportunity to acquire digitalis in the requisite quantities would prove considerably more limited than one might assume in a larger urban setting." At that precise moment, Sergeant Hartley's voice emerged from the front entrance, calling for Inspector Blackwood with an urgency that suggested developments of significance had occurred during his absence. Blackwood excused himself and moved toward the entrance with the swift stride that duty demanded, leaving Miss Marple, Dr. Fielding, and Dr. Ashford in an arrangement that suddenly seemed considerably more fraught with unspoken tension than it had moments before. "I believe I shall return to my lodgings," Dr. Ashford announced, rising from his chair with deliberate calm. "This has been a most distressing afternoon, and I find myself in need of solitude in which to process the events that have transpired. Inspector Blackwood knows where to locate me should he require further statement." Miss Marple observed the precise moment when Edmund Fielding's jaw tightened at Dr. Ashford's announcement, and the manner in which his hand reached out as if to detain his colleague, then withdrew without making contact. The gesture was subtle, yet it conveyed volumes regarding the complicated history that apparently existed between these two men. "Dr. Ashford," Edmund said quietly, his voice carrying an undertone of meaning that transcended the literal words being spoken, "I wonder whether you might consider remaining available to the investigation. Given the nature of the crime and the various inquiries that Inspector Blackwood may yet wish to pursue, your departure from the village might be construed as potentially suspicious." Dr. Ashford paused in his movement toward the hallway, and when he turned back, his expression had acquired a quality of hardened resolve that suggested he had been expecting this moment. "Dr. Fielding, I am considerably older than you, and I have spent considerably more time navigating the complexities of human behavior and institutional authority. I assure you that remaining in this village offers me nothing but the opportunity to be implicated in a crime I did not commit. My departure will be hastened by the next available conveyance." Before Edmund could respond, Inspector Blackwood reappeared, his expression confirming that Sergeant Hartley had indeed delivered information of investigative significance. Behind him came the sergeant himself, and between them was a young man of approximately 25, whose appearance suggested he had been brought to the manor with considerable haste. His collar was disheveled, his hair somewhat disarranged, and his expression carried the particular quality of someone who had suddenly found himself embroiled in circumstances considerably more complex than he had anticipated. "This is Thomas Wickham," Blackwood announced, gesturing toward the young man with the formal precision of introduction. Sergeant Hartley located him attempting to depart Little Brackley by railway. Upon questioning, Mr. Wickham has provided some rather illuminating information regarding his relationship with the deceased and the circumstances surrounding the garden party this afternoon. Thomas Wickham looked profoundly uncomfortable, his eyes darting between the assembled individuals with the quality of an animal seeking escape routes. He was a thin youth with the kind of nervous energy that suggested either guilt or considerable anxiety regarding circumstances beyond his control. When he finally spoke, his voice emerged thin and somewhat tremulous. "I didn't poison him," Wickham said immediately, the words tumbling forth as if he had been holding them back under considerable pressure. "I swear I had nothing to do with his death. Yes, I spoke with him this afternoon. Yes, I obtained employment specifically to gain access to the garden party, but it was for an entirely innocent purpose." "Explain," Inspector Blackwood commanded, his notepad already positioned for documentation. "Charles Merriweather was involved in a business venture with my uncle," Wickham replied, his words accelerating as he attempted to establish his innocence through the provision of information. "My uncle invested a considerable sum, nearly £5,000, in what Charles represented as a shipping enterprise. The money disappeared. Charles claimed the investment had failed, that there had been unforeseen circumstances. But my uncle discovered evidence suggesting that Charles had never actually invested the money in any enterprise whatsoever. Charles had simply stolen it." Miss Marple felt the various pieces of information she had been accumulating throughout the afternoon suddenly solidify into a coherent pattern. The financial difficulties, the agitation Charles had displayed, the mysterious conversation Dr. Ashford had witnessed, all of these now possessed an explanation. However, the pattern that emerged raised considerably more questions than it answered. "And what precisely did you intend to accomplish by gaining employment at this garden party?" Blackwood inquired, his tone suggesting he already suspected the answer. "I was to confront Charles regarding the stolen money," Wickham admitted, his voice dropping. "My uncle wished to give him an opportunity to make restitution before involving the authorities. But when I arrived at the garden party, I discovered that Charles had apparently already consumed a considerable quantity of alcohol. I attempted to speak with him privately, but he seemed confused, disoriented. I decided to delay the confrontation until a more appropriate moment. I never attempted to poison him. I swear it upon my life." Inspector Blackwood regarded Thomas Wickham with the expression of a man attempting to determine whether he was observing genuine distress or accomplished deception. His notepad remained poised, though he did not immediately document Wickham's statement. Instead, he allowed a moment of careful silence to expand between them, that particular investigative technique that encouraged further elaboration through the simple absence of immediate response. "You obtained employment specifically to gain access to this garden party," Blackwood repeated, his tone neither accusatory nor credulous, but rather inviting clarification. "Yet you describe your purpose as merely confrontational, not criminal. That strikes me as a considerable expenditure of effort and duplicity for what you characterize as a conversation." Wickham's discomfort deepened, his fingers working against each other with the nervous energy of someone attempting to manage anxiety through physical manifestation. "My uncle is not a forgiving man, Inspector. When I explained that I had been unable to locate Charles to demand return of the funds, he suggested alternative methods of persuasion. I was supposed to obtain access to his private correspondence, his financial documents, anything that might prove his theft and provide leverage for forcing restitution." "And did you succeed in obtaining such documents?" Blackwood inquired. "No, sir. I had intended to search his study during the garden party, but the household staff remained remarkably vigilant. Every room was monitored. I never found the opportunity to conduct a thorough search." Wickham's voice carried the particular quality of someone admitting failure rather than guilt, a distinction that Miss Marple, observing from her position near the porcelain display, recognized as potentially significant. Dr. Ashford had moved toward the entrance with renewed determination, clearly intending to depart before he could become further entangled in the investigation's expanding complications. However, Inspector Blackwood's raised hand halted his movement with the authority of official position. "Dr. Ashford, I must request that you remain available for further questioning. Your familiarity with Mr. Merriweather and your recent return to Little Brackley after an extended absence suggest that you may possess information relevant to our investigation." The words were phrased as a request, but the undertone of authority transformed them into something considerably more directive. Dr. Ashford paused, and Miss Marple observed the precise moment when he recognized that departure would only deepen suspicion regarding his involvement. His expression shifted into resignation, though it was the resignation of someone who had anticipated precisely this complication. "Very well," Dr. Ashford replied, his voice maintaining its characteristic composure despite the obvious strain evident in the lines around his eyes. "Though I must confess that I fail to perceive what relevance my presence in Little Brackley possesses regarding Charles Merriweather's death. I have not seen my nephew in several years. Our relationship was cordial but not intimate. I cannot imagine how my recent return could possibly intersect with his demise." "Yet you encountered him 2 weeks ago outside the post office," Blackwood noted, consulting his earlier notes, during which conversation he made statements suggesting significant personal distress regarding matters of ownership and protection. "You subsequently attended the garden party this afternoon, during which your nephew was poisoned. The connection may not be immediately apparent, but it warrants investigation." Miss Marple found her attention drawn toward Dr. Edmund Fielding, whose expression had shifted into something beyond mere professional concern. His jaw remained tightly clenched, and his fingers gripped the armrest of his chair with sufficient force that his knuckles had blanched to a pale white. She observed the precise moment when he appeared to reach some internal decision, when he seemed to steel himself for the articulation of something he had apparently been deliberating throughout the afternoon's unfolding events. "Inspector Blackwood," Edmund said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of someone about to betray a confidence or reveal information that professional ethics had previously demanded remain concealed. "I find myself in a position of considerable difficulty. There are matters regarding Charles Merriweather that came to my attention in my professional capacity as village physician. However, many of these matters involve other individuals in the village, and the revelation of such information could result in significant harm to innocent parties." Blackwood's expression sharpened with renewed investigative interest. "Dr. Fielding, I must inform you that withholding information relevant to a murder investigation places you in a precarious legal position. Whatever confidentiality concerns you may possess must yield to the requirements of justice in this matter." Edmund rose from his chair and moved toward the window, his posture suggesting internal conflict of considerable intensity. When he finally spoke, his voice emerged carefully controlled, as if he had practiced the precise words multiple times before finally allowing them to escape into articulation. "Charles Merriweather had been engaging in conduct that I became aware of through medical examination of another village resident. There is no delicate way to articulate this. He had been engaged in relationships of an intimate nature with individuals who were not his wife. Moreover, one of these relationships involved a party whose social circumstances rendered such an involvement particularly compromising. The implications of this statement seemed to reverberate through the hallway with the intensity of a struck bell. Miss Marple felt the various pieces of information she had accumulated throughout the afternoon rearrange themselves yet again, creating new patterns and new possibilities. The financial difficulties, the stolen funds, the stolen reputation, and now the revelation of infidelity and compromised relationships. "Which individual?" Blackwood pressed, his notepad already positioned for documentation. "You must provide specificity, Dr. Fielding." Edmund's jaw tightened, and he appeared to wage an internal battle between professional ethics and legal obligation. When he finally responded, his voice emerged barely above a whisper. Victoria Merryweather's sister, Catherine. She is merely 19 years old, and Charles had been conducting an affair with her for approximately 8 months. Victoria discovered the affair approximately 1 month ago. The revelation seemed to create a kind of vacuum in the hallway, as if the air itself had been displaced by the weight of this information. Inspector Blackwood's expression underwent a subtle transformation, the lines of his face reconfiguring into the particular intensity of someone whose investigation had just acquired considerably greater complexity and considerably greater clarity simultaneously. "Catherine Merryweather," Blackwood repeated, as if the act of articulation would somehow make the statement more comprehensible. "Victoria's younger sister, and this affair was discovered by Victoria approximately 1 month ago." "Approximately," Edmund confirmed, his shoulders bearing the physical weight of the confidentiality he had just breached. "Victoria confronted Charles regarding the matter. She informed me of this confrontation only recently, when she sought my advice regarding whether she should inform her mother of Charles's infidelity. I counseled discretion, believing that the matter would be resolved through private discussion between husband and wife. I did not anticipate that the situation would escalate to this." Miss Marple observed the precise moment when Thomas Wickham's expression shifted into comprehension of the complex web of motives and circumstances that had apparently surrounded Charles Merryweather's final hours. The young man's earlier certainty regarding his own innocence now seemed to acquire a new dimension. Not merely the innocence of one who had not committed a particular crime, but rather the innocence of someone who had been operating within circumstances considerably more complicated than he had understood. "Where is Catherine Merryweather currently?" Blackwood inquired, his notepad already documenting the new direction the investigation had assumed. "I shall require immediate statement from her regarding her relationship with Charles and her whereabouts this afternoon." "She resides with her family at Merryweather Manor," Edmund replied. "Though I should mention that Catherine has been maintaining a residence in town for the past several months, ostensibly to pursue studies in art. In reality, the arrangement provided her with the privacy necessary to conduct her affair with Charles without immediate detection." Dr. Ashford, who had been observing this exchange with the particular intensity of someone watching events that possessed direct bearing on his own circumstances, suddenly spoke with renewed urgency. "Inspector, I must inform you that I arrived at Merryweather Manor this morning specifically because Constance summoned me. She provided no explicit reason for her summons, but her letter suggested that she possessed knowledge of events she deemed sufficiently serious to warrant my immediate return to the village. I assumed she wished to discuss various family matters that had accumulated during my 5-year absence. However, in light of what Dr. Fielding has just revealed, I suspect her concerns were considerably more specific." Inspector Blackwood turned toward Dr. Ashford with renewed investigative focus. "And did you discuss these concerns with Mrs. Merryweather upon your arrival?" "Only briefly," Dr. Ashford replied. "Constance seemed reluctant to articulate her concerns before the garden party commenced. She suggested that we discuss the matter more thoroughly following the event. Obviously, that conversation never occurred." The implication was clear, though none of the assembled individuals seemed immediately disposed to articulate it. Mrs. Merryweather had apparently possessed knowledge of circumstances within her household that she deemed sufficiently serious to warrant her brother's involvement. Catherine's affair with Charles, combined with Charles' financial malfeasance and his apparent theft from Thomas Wickham's uncle, suggested a constellation of secrets and resentments that provided considerable motivation for violence. Yet Miss Marple, observing this unfolding revelation, found herself troubled by a certain discordance in the narrative that seemed to be developing. The poisoning appeared calculated, deliberate, the work of someone with both knowledge and access to cardiac glycosides. Thomas Wickham possessed neither. Catherine Merryweather, a 19-year-old woman of limited independent resources, seemed unlikely to possess the pharmaceutical knowledge requisite for obtaining and administering such a substance. Even Victoria, whose motive was perhaps most evident, betrayal by a husband engaged in an affair with her own sister, seemed to lack the particular combination of opportunity and expertise that the crime appeared to require. "I believe," Miss Marple ventured, her voice so quietly articulated that the assembled men initially seemed uncertain whether she had actually spoken, "that we are examining this matter through an insufficiently comprehensive lens. We have identified various motives: financial betrayal, sexual infidelity, family shame, all of which provide adequate reason for an individual to harbor homicidal intent. However, the actual commission of the crime requires not merely motive, but also opportunity and means. The means appears to be cardiac glycoside, likely digitalis. The opportunity was clearly provided by the garden party and the general accessibility of the refreshment table. But the question of means, the acquisition and preparation of a lethal dose of digitalis, remains insufficiently addressed. Inspector Blackwood regarded Miss Marple with an expression that suggested he was reassessing his initial evaluation of her significance to the investigation. "Miss Marple, you raise an important point. The question of how one acquires digitalis in sufficient quantities to effect death is indeed central to determining culpability. I have been reflecting upon this matter," Miss Marple continued with her characteristic methodical precision, "and I find myself wondering whether we have adequately considered the role of professional knowledge in this crime. Dr. Fielding possesses extensive familiarity with cardiac glycosides. Dr. Ashford, as a retired physician, would similarly possess such knowledge. Indeed, both of these individuals would have access to such substances through legitimate medical channels that would leave no investigative trace of acquisition." Edmund Fielding's expression shifted into something beyond mere professional concern. His hand moved to his throat once more, that involuntary gesture that Miss Marple had observed earlier and had filed away as potentially significant. "Miss Marple, I must protest," Edmund began, his voice carrying an edge of urgency. "I am not suggesting culpability on your part, Dr. Fielding," Miss Marple interrupted gently. "Rather, I am suggesting that the investigation might benefit from determining precisely which individuals possessed both motive and the specific pharmaceutical knowledge necessary to effect this particular form of death. Once that determination is made, the question of opportunity becomes considerably simpler to address." Inspector Blackwood allowed Miss Marple's observation to settle into the space between them with the weight of its implications. His notepad remained open, though he did not immediately document her words. Instead, he appeared to be engaging in that particular form of mental reorganization that accompanied the reconstruction of investigative theory in light of newly significant information. "Miss Marple," Blackwood said carefully, "your suggestion regarding pharmaceutical knowledge is astute, though I confess I'm somewhat reluctant to pursue an investigation that would implicate either of the village's medical practitioners without considerably more substantive evidence." "Evidence," Miss Marple replied gently, "frequently emerges only after one has identified the direction in which investigation should proceed. However, I do not suggest that pharmaceutical knowledge alone provides sufficient basis for accusation. What interests me far more is the question of motive that transcends the obvious motives we have thus far identified." At that precise moment, Sergeant Hartley reappeared at the entrance to the hallway, his expression suggesting that his continued investigations had yielded information of considerable significance. He carried a small leather satchel, which he presented to Inspector Blackwood with the careful precision of someone handling evidence of potential evidentiary value. "Inspector, we discovered this concealed in Mr. Wickham's lodgings," Hartley reported, his professional demeanor barely concealing evident excitement regarding his discovery. "It contains correspondence between Charles Merriweather and an individual named Dr. Edward Ashford. The letters suggest a considerably more complicated relationship than Dr. Ashford has thus far disclosed." Dr. Ashford's expression underwent a transformation so rapid that Miss Marple nearly missed the transition from controlled composure to something approaching panic. His hand moved toward the satchel as if to retrieve it, then withdrew when he recognized that Sergeant Hartley possessed it beyond his reach. "Those letters are private correspondence," Dr. Ashford said, his voice acquiring an edge of desperation that had previously been absent. "They were obtained without authorization and cannot be considered admissible evidence in any legitimate investigation." "Nevertheless," Inspector Blackwood replied, opening the satchel with careful deliberation, "they may provide context regarding relationships and circumstances that bear upon the present investigation." He withdrew several envelopes, each containing multiple pages of correspondence written in what appeared to be Charles Merryweather's hand. His eyes moved across the pages with increasing rapidity as he absorbed their contents. When Blackwood finally looked up from the correspondence, his expression had shifted into the particular clarity of comprehension that accompanied the emergence of previously obscured truth. "Dr. Ashford, these letters suggest that Charles Merryweather was engaged in a business venture with you. Specifically, a venture involving the attempted acquisition of certain pharmaceutical compounds for purposes that appear questionable in their legitimacy. Charles was acting in his capacity as my business agent," Dr. Ashford replied carefully, his voice resuming its characteristic composure despite the evident strain. "I maintain consulting relationships with various medical institutions and research facilities. Charles was assisting me in acquiring certain compounds for legitimate research purposes." Miss Marple found herself examining Dr. Ashford with renewed attention. The man possessed an undeniable air of authority and respectability that would have made most individuals trust his explanations implicitly. However, she had observed something during this exchange that seemed to contradict his stated innocence. When Blackwood had mentioned the letters, Dr. Ashford's initial reaction had been not merely protective of his privacy, but rather a kind of visceral panic. The panic of someone confronted with exposure of circumstances considerably more serious than mere business indiscretion. "Dr. Ashford," Miss Marple said softly, her voice interrupting the exchange between Blackwood and the retired physician, "I wonder whether you might explain the precise nature of Charles Merryweather's financial difficulties. You mentioned earlier, if I recall correctly, that Charles appeared agitated regarding matters of ownership and protection. Would it be accurate to suggest that Charles had discovered, or believed he had discovered, that the business venture you two had undertaken possessed purposes rather different from those you had represented to him?" Dr. Ashford did not respond immediately. His eyes moved toward the window, then back toward Miss Marple, and in that moment of observation, she witnessed the internal calculation that occurred when a man recognized that his carefully constructed narrative was unraveling. "Charles was a fool," Dr. Ashford said finally, his voice emerging with a quality of resigned bitterness. "He believed himself far more clever than he actually was. He agreed to assist me in acquiring digitalis and other cardiac glycosides, ostensibly for research purposes. However, when he eventually deduced my true intentions, he became difficult. He threatened to expose my activities to the authorities. He believed he possessed leverage sufficient to compel me into providing him with capital to address his financial difficulties." "And what were your true intentions, Dr. Ashford?" Inspector Blackwood inquired, though Miss Marple suspected he had already deduced the answer through his reading of the correspondence. "I was conducting research," Dr. Ashford replied, his voice acquiring a quality of defensive justification. "Research that mainstream medical institutions deemed insufficiently ethical to pursue through official channels. I was investigating the properties of certain compounds in the context of manipulating cardiac function. The applications could have revolutionized cardiac medicine. However, the institutional authorities refused to recognize the legitimacy of my work. You were developing methods of deliberately inducing cardiac failure," Miss Marple said gently, not as question but as statement of fact. "Methods that would appear to observers as natural death. Charles discovered your intentions and attempted to exploit your vulnerability." Dr. Ashford's silence confirmed the accuracy of Miss Marple's assessment. Dr. Edmund Fielding, who had been observing this exchange with an expression of dawning comprehension, suddenly moved forward. "Edward," Edmund said, his voice carrying the weight of decades of friendship and professional alliance. "You did not. You could not have. Not to Charles. Not despite everything." "Charles gave me no alternative," Dr. Ashford replied, his voice emerging hollow and distant. "He was going to destroy everything I had worked toward, everything I had sacrificed for." Inspector Blackwood's hand moved toward his notepad with the mechanical precision of someone whose investigative instincts had shifted into the particular mode that accompanied confession and resolution. Yet before he could document Dr. Ashford's apparent admission, Miss Marple raised her hand with a gesture that carried surprising authority for someone of her diminutive stature and advancing years. "I must confess, Inspector," Miss Marple said quietly, "that I do not believe Dr. Ashford is providing us with a complete accounting of the circumstances surrounding Charles Merryweather's death. There are elements of this narrative that remain inconsistent with the facts as we have observed them." All attention in the hallway shifted toward Miss Marple, whose continued presence seemed to have transformed from that of an interested observer into something considerably more authoritative. Even Inspector Blackwood, accustomed to the prerogatives of his official position, appeared inclined to defer to her observation. "Continue, Miss Marple," Blackwood encouraged, settling back into a posture of receptive attention. "Dr. Ashford possesses both knowledge and means sufficient to commit this crime," Miss Marple explained, moving with careful deliberation toward the window. "However, I find myself troubled by certain details regarding opportunity. Dr. Ashford was present at the garden party, but so was Dr. Fielding. More significantly, the teacup from which Charles drank was refilled multiple times throughout the afternoon by various staff members, and, indeed, by Charles himself, when he visited the refreshment table. The timing of the poisoning would need to be extraordinarily precise to ensure that Charles would consume the toxic substance at the exact moment he did." Dr. Edmund Fielding's expression shifted, and Miss Marple observed the precise instant when recognition transformed his face. It was a recognition not of Dr. Ashford's guilt, but rather of something considerably more complicated and considerably more personal. "There is another possibility," Miss Marple continued, her pale blue eyes moving toward Edmund with the certainty of someone who had finally arranged the scattered pieces of a puzzle into coherent form. "What if the poisoning was not precipitated by Charles's threats regarding Dr. Ashford's research? What if the motivation was something far more immediate, far more personal, and far more desperate?" Edmund Fielding's hand trembled as he attempted to maintain his composure, but the trembling increased rather than diminished as Miss Marple moved closer to articulating her conclusions. "You see," Miss Marple explained to the assembled group, her voice maintaining its characteristic gentleness despite the gravity of her observation, "I have been troubled by Margaret Fielding's reactions throughout this afternoon. When Dr. Fielding first examined Charles's body, Margaret's response was not merely shock at the discovery of death. It was something far more complex, a kind of relief mingled with anxiety. And when Dr. Fielding mentioned the likelihood of poisoning, Margaret gripped her husband's arm with a force that suggested not comforting support, but rather desperate communication of some urgent matter." Inspector Blackwood's notepad was already positioned, though he allowed Miss Marple to continue her exposition without interruption. "Margaret Fielding is 15 years younger than her husband," Miss Marple observed, "a considerable age disparity, though not uncommon. However, I've noted that Margaret frequently glances toward Dr. Ashford when she believes herself unobserved. And Dr. Ashford, despite his profession of having been absent from Little Brackley for 5 years, seemed remarkably aware of current village affairs and family dynamics." Dr. Ashford's expression underwent a subtle transformation, and he turned toward Miss Marple with an expression of dawning comprehension. "You are suggesting," Dr. Ashford said slowly, "that Margaret and that there is a personal connection between us that predates my departure from the village." "I'm suggesting nothing," Miss Marple replied gently. I am merely observing that certain human behaviors reveal truths that individuals themselves may wish to conceal. Margaret's nervousness today was not the nervousness of guilt regarding poisoning. It was the nervousness of someone whose personal secrets were threatened with exposure by the death of someone who possessed knowledge of those secrets. Edmund Fielding sank into a chair, his face draining of color. "Margaret," he said quietly, as if articulating her name might somehow alter the direction in which this conversation was proceeding. "Margaret, what has Miss Marple suggested? What is she implying?" Margaret Fielding, who had been standing apart from the assembled group in a posture of careful distance, suddenly stepped forward with a gesture that seemed to carry the weight of resignation and relief simultaneously. "Edward and I knew each other before you returned to Little Brackley, Edmund," Margaret said, her voice emerging with the particular quality of someone finally articulating a truth that had been weighing upon her consciousness. "Years ago, when I was younger and considerably less certain of my future. When you asked me to marry you, I accepted because I believed that a respectable marriage to a respected physician represented security and stability. However, when Edward returned to the village, when I saw him again, I realized that the feelings I had, believed myself to have transcended, never actually subsided. They merely lay dormant." "Margaret," Edmund said, his voice carrying the particular anguish of betrayal, "what does this have to do with Charles's death?" "Charles discovered the truth," Margaret replied, her expression hardening. "He observed Edward and me speaking together at various social functions. He noticed our interactions and deduced what they signified. He came to me approximately 2 weeks ago and informed me that he intended to reveal our affair to you unless I provided him with a considerable sum of money. He was desperate, Edmund. His financial circumstances had become genuinely precarious. He believed that blackmailing me represented his only path to solvency." Inspector Blackwood's expression clarified with the particular certainty of investigative comprehension. "And you decided to eliminate the threat he represented?" "I decided that Charles Merriweather did not deserve to destroy multiple lives for the sake of his own financial mismanagement," Margaret replied coldly. "I obtained digitalis from my father's medical cabinet. He was a physician before his retirement. I calculated a dose that would produce cardiac arrest, and I deliberately served Charles a cup of tea into which I had dissolved the substance. I ensured that the poisoning occurred during the garden party, when there would be sufficient confusion and disruption to obscure the precise timing of his consumption of the toxic beverage." Dr. Ashford moved toward Margaret with an expression of complex emotion, shock, concern, and something approaching protective instinct, despite the evidence of her culpability. "You did this for me?" Dr. Ashford asked, his voice emerging barely above a whisper. "Margaret, you poisoned a man to protect our secret." "I did it to protect us both," Margaret replied. "I did it to prevent Edmund from discovering a truth that would have destroyed our marriage and humiliated us both. Publicly. I did it because Charles Merriweather was precisely the sort of person who believed that other people's suffering was an acceptable price for his own financial comfort." Miss Marple observed the complex tangle of human motivation that had manifested itself through the course of this afternoon. Infidelity, financial desperation, blackmail, and ultimately murder. All of these elements had woven themselves together into a narrative that transcended simple morality and revealed instead the profound complications of human nature when confronted with circumstances that threatened the careful structures individuals had constructed around their lives. Inspector Blackwood moved toward Margaret Fielding with the formal precision of his official duty. "Margaret Fielding, I must inform you that you are under arrest for the murder of Charles Merriweather. You have the right to remain silent, and anything you say may be used as evidence in proceedings against you." As Sergeant Hartley moved to escort Margaret from the hallway, Miss Marple remained standing quietly near the window, her small frame silhouetted against the fading light of late afternoon. The garden beyond, which had been transformed that morning into a space of social gathering and aesthetic perfection, now appeared diminished and somewhat sad, as if it too recognized that violence and betrayal had occurred within its carefully cultivated boundaries. Dr. Edmund Fielding remained seated in his chair, his face bearing the particular expression of someone whose understanding of his own life had undergone fundamental alteration. Dr. Ashford stood motionless, his attention focused on the doorway through which Margaret had been led, his expression suggesting that he was processing not merely the revelation of Margaret's crime, but also the deeper significance of the choices that had motivated it. Thomas Wickham, having been cleared of suspicion regarding Charles's death, stood with the particular awkwardness of someone suddenly rendered superfluous to the proceedings that had absorbed everyone's attention. His uncle's stolen money remained unrecovered. His own culpability in attempting blackmail remained technically unchallenged, yet in the context of an actual murder, such matters seemed to have receded into comparative insignificance. Inspector Blackwood approached Miss Marple with an expression of genuine professional respect. "Miss Marple, your observations have been instrumental in resolving this matter. How did you arrive at your conclusions regarding Margaret Fielding's guilt?" Miss Marple turned from her examination of the garden and regarded the inspector with those pale blue eyes that seemed to contain within them the accumulated understanding of decades of observing human nature. "It was quite simple, really," Miss Marple replied gently. "You see, I've spent a considerable portion of my life in a small village not dissimilar to Little Brackley. In such places, one learns that human behavior follows patterns as reliable as the rotation of seasons. When I observed Margaret's reactions to various developments throughout this afternoon, I recognized in her expression the particular combination of relief and anxiety that characterized someone who had committed an act of desperation and was now confronted with the consequences of that desperation. More significantly, I observed that Margaret's anxieties seemed to center not on her own culpability, but rather on the protection of someone else. That protective instinct, combined with her obvious connection to Dr. Ashford and her knowledge of her father's medical background, suggested a narrative that was considerably more coherent than the alternative explanations we had been considering. "And regarding the method of poisoning," Blackwood inquired, "how did you determine that Margaret had access to the digitalis?" "I did not determine it with certainty until she herself articulated it," Miss Marple explained. "However, I noted that of the various individuals present at the garden party who possessed pharmaceutical knowledge and access to cardiac glycosides, Margaret was the least obvious suspect. This very lack of obviousness suggested to me that she might indeed be guilty. Often, I found, the most effective crimes are committed by those who initially appear to possess the least motive and the least capability." As evening settled across Little Brackley, transforming the garden from a scene of aesthetic perfection into something touched by darkness and shadow, Miss Marple retired to her room at Merryweather Manor, having been invited to remain as a guest while the formal proceedings regarding Margaret Fielding's arrest proceeded through their necessary channels. She sat in a comfortable chair near her window, a cup of tea cooling on the table beside her, and reflected on the complicated intersection of human desire, desperation, and the choices that individuals made when confronted with circumstances that threatened the carefully constructed narratives of their lives. The rose garden, visible from her window, seemed to hold within its darkness a kind of permanence that transcended the temporary upheavals of human tragedy. Beauty and violence, she reflected, existed in constant tension throughout the natural world and throughout human society. To understand one required understanding the other, and to navigate the complexities of village life required recognition that beneath the surface of respectability and social convention lay depths of complication that could, when circumstances aligned precisely, manifest themselves in the most unexpected and devastating forms.